Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Louisa. If you're new, don't forget to subscribe, and if you're coming back, welcome back.
Do you believe in God? Regardless of the answer to that question, you very likely didn't think I was talking about believing in Quetzalcoatl, or Zeus, or any of the tens of thousands of gods that have existed in human history. You probably assumed I was referring to whether or not you believed in a specific God, the Abrahamic God of the Christian Bible and the Torah. But how did a mere storm god become the all-powerful deity of half of the world? And how come we don't know his name? Here we are not going to look at what the Bible says about God, but rather what history says about the Bible, where the idea of this God came from, and how he took over the modern world. YHWH, Yahweh or Yahweh as more scholars call him, or Jehovah if you prefer to use a name invented in the 16th century, is the Abrahamic God and the God of the nation of Israel. And believe it or not, we don't know for certain where this God originated from beyond the fact that he comes from the Levant region. Most scholars believe that he was initially some kind of deity related to war. Although his origins have been lost to time, the earliest we can trace his existence is to the end of the Bronze Age, with the oldest possible appearance being an inscription from the time of Amenhotep III about the Jazu, or JHWA, with the Jazu being nomadic Arabs. But at that time, Yahweh wasn't the almighty, all-knowing God who created everything and knows it all. He was just one divinity within a larger pantheon, similar to how Ares is the god of war in the Greek pantheon, but is neither the most powerful nor the most important god. He was such an unimportant god that there are no records of his origins because he was a secondary god. Of course, everyone knows about Zeus and Poseidon, but very few know about Eris, the goddess of descents and insults. And Yahweh was even less important than Eris because we know more about her than we know about Yahweh. It wasn't until the early Iron Age that Yahweh began to gain importance and started appearing in history. At that time, a group of Canaanites were becoming independent, forming their own culture, and well on the way to becoming the Israelites, so they needed a new god. Okay, thank you, silence, please. We're checking to see if we have everything we need to be our own civilization. Let's see if we have everything on the list. Agriculture? That's Bob's responsibility. It seems to be going well. Economy? Well, we decided that any people we defeat will be our slaves forever and ever, so that's all good. The modem is getting installed on Tuesday, and I think that would be... Oh, wait! Who's going to be your main god? Mary Jane. Bob, we're going to change your job. That's not a real god, and we can't just take the same gods we used to have as Canaanites. We broke away from them because we wanted to be different. How about Zeus? The new god of the Greeks? That one would make it 100 years. Yahweh. What? Yahweh. Wait, isn't that the storm god? Not just any kind of storms. It's not the kind of storms you want to come to renew the land. It's the kind of storms you fear. The ones that destroy houses, crops, and civilizations. That's the God we need. Not a creation God, the God of destruction to instill fear in our enemies and our future slaves. Are you sure we should enslave people? Why not start a society based on mutual support and common good so we can progress as humanity? Okay then, Yahweh's our god. Once the Israelites adopted Yahweh as their god from the Canaanite pantheon, this storm and Yahweh good so we can progress as humanity. Okay then, Yahweh's our god. Once the Israelites adopted Yahweh as their god from the Canaanite pantheon, this storm and war god of the Israelites became their main, most important god. That is exactly why he is described as the god of the armies and as a divine warrior in multiple instances, not only in archaeological evidence, but also in the Bible. As a god of storms and destruction, he was associated with lightning storms and floods, and although I couldn't find a historian's opinion on the matter, it seems very logical to me that this is why he was associated right from the beginning with the flood myth, when the Israelites adopted that myth, which, remember, ends with a promise not to destroy humans again, with the flood. It makes more sense if you think of Yahweh as an angry storm god who kept flooding more and more people every time he was enraged, culminating in the Great Flood, when he destroyed so much that he decided never to do it again. By this point, Yahweh had gone from being a secondary storm god to the main god of an entire nation. Not bad for a god so unimportant that no one cared to preserve his origins. And this god was gradually becoming an exceptional god. The oldest known temple dedicated to Yahweh is an open-air altar dated to the 12th century BC in the hills of Samaria with a bronze bull. Why a bull? Well, because in the beginning bulls were associated with Yahweh and with other similar Canaanite gods. Remember, at that time, it was common to use idols as representations of the god you worship. So that altar is quite similar to other religious altars of that era. But something very odd began to happen. Over time, bulls almost completely disappeared from the cult of Yahweh and were not replaced by anything else. Instead, Yahweh became completely aniconic, which means that he was not represented by a statue or by anything less abstract than some stones. Even in his most famous relic, the Ark of the Covenant, Yahweh is not depicted anywhere. Instead, according to the Bible, Yahweh would appear before the priest sitting on his throne alongside the cherubim when the priest conducted a religious ceremony. But the throne itself is portrayed as empty. Now, having a storm god as your primary god is pretty good if you want to do what the Israelites did and have an excuse to exterminate any nation you want to take their stuff. But not every problem is solved with violence. Almost every problem, but not every problem. Sometimes you need a god that's more paternal, a god that's smarter, a god that's sexier. So what happens when you want to ask something from a god, but your national god isn't the type who specializes in those kinds of petitions? Well, you look for another god who does specialize in what you're asking, of course. That is why, although the Israelites worship Yahweh as their main national god, they did not worship him as their only god, at least not initially. You can see this in the story of Rachel and her father Laban, a very ancient biblical story. In Genesis chapter 31, we learn how Rachel had stolen her father's household idols, hiding them in her camel saddle. These idols were for worshipping other entities, not Yahweh, because remember, Yahweh was never associated with this type of idol, and they were also used to worship ancestors and practice divination. But by the time that the Bible was being compiled, worshipping exclusively Yahweh was becoming more fashionable among the Israelites, beginning with the prophet Elijah in the 9th century BC, and then gradually several prophets began saying that Yahweh wanted exclusive worship. However, neither Elijah nor the other prophets ever said that the other gods were false or did not exist. And Elijah never said that there weren't other gods. He simply said that Yahweh was the super coolest, bestest God that the Israelites should worship, apart from the two gods that the Israelites already worshipped. Because although Yahweh was their national God, he was only one of many gods in the Canaanite pantheon. If you look at the Greek pantheon, there is a god of war, a goddess for art, there's a god for everything. But the most important one is the god of the gods, Zeus. Yahweh was the god of storms, but the most important god in that pantheon was El, or Elohim. This is the god of gods, the main god of the divine council, the creator god, the wise god, and the god with a long white beard you imagine when you think of God. Remember, Yahweh was a storm god without icons, but Elohim was the greater, older, and wiser God who had created everything. But by the time that the Bible was being written, Yahweh and Elohim were already being merged into the same God. Over generations outside of the Canaanite influence, the Israelites began to forget the original pantheon and started worshipping both gods, first together and then as the same God. Yet, traces of Elohim as the supreme God and his divine council can still be found in the Bible. In Psalm 82, we hear about the Most High, another way of referencing Elohim, pronouncing judgment among the gods and reminding them that they are his children. In Job 1, Satan even appears before a divine council, claiming that he had been roaming the earth from one end to the other. And in chapter 38 of Deuteronomy, we even see Elohim and Yahweh as separate gods. This chapter is fascinating because it talks about how the God El, the Most High, divides humanity by giving different portions to different gods, and giving Yahweh his own portion of humanity, which perfectly aligns with what we know the Israelites believed while the Bible was being written, that there were many gods in the world, but that their God, as Israelites, was Yahweh. This not only shows that Yahweh was inferior to El, but also how different the two gods were. While Yahweh is a warrior, destructive, and enraged God, El is a patient, wise, and powerful creator, the father of all, including Yahweh. Originally, Yahweh was not even associated with creative powers. Those powers would almost contradict his nature, as he did not need them as a warlike, destructive deity. He is so far removed from being a creator that when the Old Testament speaks of creative work, it does not use Yahweh in the form of the Tetragrammaton, but rather El or Elohim. We can see another example of how Elohim speaks to the divine council when he says, "Let us make" in Genesis 1, something that wouldn't make sense if he were the only being, as the modern creation myth is. This is because even though Elohim was the most powerful deity, he is not omniscient or all-powerful, nor is any other god in the pantheon. That is why you need prayers and sacrifices to catch his attention and have your request fulfilled, just like with the other gods. Prayer doesn't make sense for an omniscient being who already knows what you're about to ask even before you do. That's why we constantly see expressions in the Bible like, "God has forgotten about me," when the psalmist wonders how long God will forget him, and in other verses. When your prayers were not answered, it was simply because you had failed to catch the attention of your God, which also explains why the Israelites began praying to other gods when their prayers and sacrifices went unanswered by their God. In the Hebrew Bible, we see how the Israelites later fused El and Yahweh into one God, with Yahweh assimilating most of El's attributes. Yahweh also took on the throne of the divine council, and the lesser gods became his angels, when this religion transformed into monotheism. However, these lesser gods are still only referred to as sons of El, not as sons of Yahweh. Later on, Yahweh is described as a merciful God, slow to anger, and in other proclamations that almost seem to contradict the nature of the original warrior Yahweh, who was once called a man of war. Have you ever wondered why God seems bipolar, super enthusiastic about war in some passages, but then described as slow to anger in others? Well, that's your answer. Yahweh was an extremely violent God. But Elohim was a wise and tremendously powerful God, and later they merged and became one. Remember, Yahweh was originally an iconic, but later he is described as the Father, a wise, old, and patient God. And even later, he becomes a literal father by sending his son to liberate humanity in the New Testament, paving the way for Yahweh not only to become the most powerful God, but the only God. Remember, in biblical times, the gods resided in specific places. Zeus and the other Greek gods had their individual temples. That was where they lived and where they were summoned when they were not residing in the Olympus. And that is why the Ark of the Covenant had a space for God to appear. That's why the Ark was so important, because that was where God dwelled. And later, a temple was built for Yahweh in Jerusalem, and just like with the other Greek gods, that was where he lived and where he was summoned. As long as the temple was there, Yahweh would be among them, for that was where his home was. That is why it was so traumatic for the Israelites when they destroyed Yahweh's temple, because now their God didn't even have a place to live. But not everyone believed that this was the end of everything. After all, if you were told for 1,000 years that your God needs a temple like all the other gods, and if you were told that the temple had been demolished a couple of times before, and that the Israelites had been enslaved only for a chosen one from God to free them and rebuild the temple, then you would probably be looking out for the next chosen one of Yahweh to free you from the Romans, so you could rebuild the temple again. And at that time, there were several candidates.
Judas the Galilean is God's chosen one in his holy war against Rome. It's the only way to ensure we can rebuild. Simon of Berea is God's chosen one to be the new king of Israel, and he, as in rebuilding his temple, Yahweh would lead him to victory against the Romans. Judas is the new prophet of Yahweh. Look, he's going to part the Jordan River just like Moses to lead. The Egyptian, he is the one who leads us to victory, and whom Yahweh has chosen to tear down the walls of our oppressor, to expel the Romans and rebuild the...
Sir, all of God's chosen ones end up being dead before they can rebuild the temple? Yeah, but I have the solution because actually, God's chosen one is this carpenter. Oh, but that one's already dead. Yup, like 30 years ago, nailed to a cross. Think about that, sir. No one's going to take a carpenter who died nailed to some planks seriously. No, surprisingly, no one will ever think about it, don't worry. But how is he going to rebuild the temple if he's already dead? That's the beauty of it. He won't. What? Yeah, look, he said that if certain things he predicted happened, then that would mean that we no longer need the temple to worship Yahweh. And what did he predict would happen for that to be possible? That he would die. No, I think we better keep looking for Yahweh's chosen one to rebuild his temple. But this chosen one is already dead, which means we don't need no temple. Yahweh has always needed, but this chosen one is already dead. Yes, but that doesn't mean that... And that means we don't need no temple. No, because, in fact, he was pretty special. He's the Messiah promised in these parts of the Testament. You know, the only Testament? Because no one has written a new one yet? I already started the new one and wrote that Jesus' body disappeared. I made another version in which he was resurrected. In my version, he's the Son of God and will save all humanity, not just the Jews. In my version, he is God. This is getting out of hand. We need to rethink this and rebuild the temple because all versions are good.
This little guy is the Jews, and this little group, the Christians. And the Christians made a monumental movement that transformed Yahweh into a God you could worship anywhere, not just in the temple, elevating him. Not only as a God who did not want you to worship other gods, but as the only God who existed. Romans tried to stop them at first, but 200 years later, Constantine converted to Christianity and went on to convert the entire Roman Empire, making its religion so powerful and widespread that it survived the fall of the Roman Empire itself, converting peoples and those across all of Europe who were not part of the empire and making them repent from their sins so they could be saved by Jesus or else. Then another group will write a sequel to the Bible claiming that Jesus Christ is not the Messiah, just another prophet, and that the true prophet was the author of that new book, a book that did not invalidate the Bible, but was just as important or more so than the Bible. If you believed them, you were a Muslim, but you were also hated and persecuted by many people. So the Muslims eventually ended up looking for land in the Middle East, building iconic temples there, and looking for more people to convert to their religion. That was the attitude of the conquerors when they found the New World and discovered it full of pagans who sacrificed people to the sun, like the sun was real. So they converted as many people to Christianity as they could and sacrificed the race so efficiently that by the time Mexico wanted to gain independence from Spain, it was a Catholic priest who united the first rebellion under the image of the Virgin Mary, which became the first official flag of the country. Then another group will write a sequel to the Bible claiming that Jesus Christ is not the Messiah, just another prophet, and that the true prophet was the author of that new book, one that did not invalidate the Bible, but was just as important or even more so than the Bible. If you believed them, you were a Mormon, but you were also hated and persecuted by many. So the Mormons ended up looking for land in the middle of Utah, United States, building iconic temples and seeking more people there to convert to their religion. This is the true history of God. A storm god so unimportant that his origin was probably lost long before he became famous. A god originated in Canaanite mythology, adopted by the Israelites as their national god, merged with Elohim to grant him creative powers, elevated by Jesus Christ so that no one needed a temple or to be Jewish in order to follow him, and with so many possible interpretations that countless religions have emerged claiming that their interpretation of God is the correct one. And the best part is that the interpretation of God as a god of war and the like was also long forgotten, and those religions have always been super respectful when debating their interpretations of God. Right?
NBC had a science fiction series on a while back. You probably remember it. It was called Star Trek.
Star Trek has inspired generations with its bold visions of the future.
Because you've been in fantasy, and obviously you're in politics, you've never been in a kind of science fiction film.
Memorable characters and groundbreaking ideas. But beyond the starships and space battles, the series is packed with hidden details, clever tricks, and behind-the-scenes secrets.
Come up on the other side and see my face and the tears are streaming and I'm in this struggle. There wasn't time to do this more than once.
That many fans never realized. From reused props to subtle nods and in-jokes, the franchise is full of surprises waiting to be uncovered.
And we got it done. When that show went on the air, my mail just went like that.
Join us as we talk about things that fans never noticed about Star Trek. 15. The most difficult scene. Fans never noticed these things about Star Trek, but they reveal some of the show's most powerful behind-the-scenes stories. Grace Lee Whitney, who played Yeoman Janice Rand in Star Trek, the original series, had a career marked by both triumph and trauma. Originally cast as a recurring character and possible love interest for Captain Kirk, she was abruptly written out of the show after just a few episodes. Years later, Whitney revealed she had been a victim of SA by a studio executive around the time of her departure, something she believed contributed to her being let go. One of her most difficult scenes was in The Enemy Within, where an evil version of her tries to assault Rand. Though deeply uncomfortable to film, she credited William Shatner for being respectful during that moment. After years of battling addiction, Whitney eventually returned to Star Trek in films and Voyager. Fans remember her for her strength and for saying Spock never needed me for my body, he needed me for my feelings, highlighting the quiet respect her character found in him. 14. Sabotaged by NBC. Star Trek, the original series wasn't just cancelled, it was quietly sabotaged. After 2 seasons of growing popularity and a massive fan-led letter-writing campaign, NBC renewed the show for a 3rd season, but with a catch. The network slashed the budget by more than 60% and moved the show to the dreaded Friday 10 p.m. time slot, where viewership was guaranteed to drop. With so little money, writers were forced to reuse sets, limit special effects, and simplify scripts to fit whatever resources were available. The show's signature creativity suffered. Gene Roddenberry, frustrated with NBC's treatment, stepped back from the series entirely. While the network didn't cancel Star Trek outright, it's clear they set it up to fail. Many fans see this as a calculated move, appeasing the fan base with a renewal while ensuring the show wouldn't survive long. Ironically, the series became a cultural icon only after NBC let it die. 13. William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy's complicated relationship. William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy shared one of Star Trek's most iconic on-screen partnerships, but their real-life relationship was far more complex. Early on during the original series, the two weren't particularly close. Shatner, as the lead, reportedly felt threatened by Nimoy's rising popularity as Spock. Over time, however, mutual respect and shared experiences turned them into genuine friends. They attended conventions together, appeared in interviews, and supported each other through major life events. But their friendship took a painful turn in the final years of Nimoy's life. According to Shatner, Nimoy suddenly stopped speaking to him without explanation. Many believe it stemmed from Shatner using footage of Nimoy in his documentary The Captains without getting proper permission. Nimoy reportedly saw this as a betrayal and never reconciled with Shatner before his death in 2015. Shatner did not attend Nimoy's funeral, citing a charity commitment which drew public criticism. Still, he later expressed deep regret, saying he tried to make amends but never got the chance. In interviews and in his book, Leonard, My 50-Year Friendship with a Remarkable Man, Shatner openly mourned the loss, not just of a co-star, but of a complicated, cherished friend. 12. The Klingon's belt buckles. If you watched the episode Day of the Dove from Star Trek, the original series, you probably noticed the Klingons storming around in their usual grumpy, war-ready style. They had tough attitudes, slick-back hair, and uniforms that screamed alien military. But did you ever really look at their belts? No, seriously, take a closer look. What might seem like shiny, high-tech armor or a futuristic buckle is, in reality, something much simpler and way cheaper. It's bubble wrap. Yes, the same stuff you pop for fun.
who I admire very is hell perhaps God's form of rehabilitation for hardcore sinners? It certainly was for me. Can people in hell call upon the name of the Lord? And of course I'm talking about calling from their heart, not just, hypocritical, pleading. And Jesus will come and rescue them. That was my experience, and I have no reason to believe that it wouldn't be somebody else's experience.
This is Beyond with Heather Tesh, where we examine near-death experiences and life itself, hopefully making this life a little better. Hello everybody, thank you so much for joining me, and I'm so grateful once again to have my guest here, Howard Storm. Hello, Howard.
Hello, Heather.
Wonderful to have you here. I want to address this at the top because I know people have some questions. They may have watched part 1, and by the way, I'll have a link to that in the description. But they may have noticed that your eyes were closed more than normal, and many people have been concerned about your health. So do you just want to fill us in a little bit on that?
Yes. Almost 6 weeks ago, I lost my eyesight, went to the emergency room, and over time, after seeing many specialists, it has been diagnosed as autoimmune disease, which caused swelling around my optic nerve, and that's why I'm blind. It has been the biggest adjustment I have ever made in my life, because prior to that, I always primarily identified myself as an artist, and I was an artist all of my life. And now that's over. And so I have been spending the past weeks trying to reconcile myself to being a different person, which is kind of hard to do when you're 77 years old, because I'm pretty fixed in my ways, but I am trying to make that adjustment and adapt to this disability, and I'm getting by.
I understand part of that, not to obviously the extent, but just the love of art. I have often said that one of the greatest gifts I've been given by God and via my mother was some artistic ability, and I love to be able to draw, and I would greatly miss that. So in that way, I can grasp what you're saying, but obviously cannot in any way fully understand what you're going through.
Yeah.
Howard, there are a lot of people that have health situations like you have. And a lot of people pray about it. And you did talk about prayer amongst many other things in your newest book, which is called Following Jesus. And one of the things that people have said to me in the comments is that they feel like God does not give them a response when it comes to prayer.
Yeah.
And I know you addressed that. So can you fill us in on your thoughts on that?
Sure. I, of course, have had those same feelings. And, I am praying that God will miraculously restore my eyesight, which all the doctors tell me is not going to happen, and that I'm permanently blind. But I'm going to keep praying to God. And whether I get my eyesight back or not is not the issue. The important thing is that praying to God, trusting God, listening to the Bible and all those good people out there like Joyce Myers and Max Lucado, etc., about how to do better in the Christian life. I have been growing enormously in my faith, and God has been giving me gifts upon gifts upon gifts to be a better follower of Jesus and to miraculously accomplish things that would have seemed impossible. Let me give you one little example. My first wife and I were married for 40 years. She is a retired attorney, lives in a residence home. And a couple of years ago, after many, many attempts to try and have some kind of relationship with her by calling her on the phone and asking her how she's doing, she made it perfectly clear to me to leave her alone, stop calling me, and she wanted nothing to do with me. That was 2 years ago. So for 2 years, we haven't talked. No communication at all. A woman that I did love and do love. And she left me, and that was devastating, but I'm over that. Anyhow, after listening to Joyce Myers, I was convicted that I needed to reach out to my ex-wife. I called her on the phone this past Saturday, and for well over an hour, we had an absolutely wonderful, happy conversation, like we were good old best friends. And I thank God for that, because it always bothered me that for reasons that I do not understand, she didn't want to have anything to do with me. And now I feel like I could call her anytime, and that we're really okay in our separated lives. That's just one okay. Which is better in the great scheme of things? To be reconciled with a woman that I do love, or to be able to keep painting my paintings? It's hard for me to say, but frankly, being restored in a relationship is better than me making my art.
Well, first of all, I just want to say, if anybody out there wants to say a prayer for Howard, I'm sure, Howard, that you would appreciate that. And also, as you spoke, it reminded me of something else that you discussed in your book, which is gratitude. Because you could easily be very bitter, and I'm sure there is a lot of pain that comes with what you're experiencing, but you're also showing gratitude. Can you talk about the importance of that in our life?
Oh, absolutely. Very, very important. It's hard to us keep this in mind, but everything in life is a gift. For example, to breathe, to have our blood circulate, to eat, to get up in the morning. Here's a biggie: to have a purpose and to try and live that purpose, to have some good friends, to have some good relationships with family, to look at a flower, to see the birds at the bird feeder. These are all gifts. And one of the things that we need to do, although we can never do it adequately, is to truly, from our heart, thank God for all the goodness and the beauty in the world. As I mentioned earlier, Jesus told me, if we look for the good in the world and look for the beauty in the world, that is what we are going to attract in our life.
I think that's an important message. Related to that, in your book, you said, whatever good we put out in the world will come back to us tenfold.
Yes.
So how does gratitude and how does kindness play into that?
I jokingly kid with God, because it has been my experience for the past almost 40 years that every time I try and do something for God, God always wins by doing more good for me. Now, I do not like the prosperity gospel. And I don't want to go into that, but, it's not about wealth. It is not about driving the $80,000 Mercedes-Benz or living in the biggest mansion in town. That is not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is real wealth. Real wealth is love, joy, and faith in such abundance that one is compelled to share that love, joy, and faith with everybody, no exceptions, with everybody that we meet, whether people appreciate it or not.
You said whether people appreciate it or not, but I've also heard you say in some instances, you have to know when to stop giving. And
yes.
Basically you said, give your love away wisely by the guidance of the Holy Spirit. Do not throw your love away where it is not welcomed. Jesus told his disciples to walk away and move on when they were not welcomed. And that caught my attention when you wrote that in this book, because I had just gotten a comment from a viewer who said she felt very guilty because she had left her abusive husband and she had cut off her relationship with her abusive husband and her parents, who also had not treated her well. And she felt a lot of guilt, and I think what you were writing there tells us sometimes the best thing to do is to walk away.
Yes, that's called discernment. There are times when we need to walk away around from people who are absolutely not interested in us or what we have to say, and may possibly be dangerous to pursue that with them. I do not push anybody beyond what my senses tell me they want to hear in terms of my faith. So when I meet a stranger, I try to listen to them very carefully, and I only go down the road of my Christian faith as far as I think they might be interested. And sometimes that means not at all and walking away.
One thing you also talked about in your book is, well, the Bible, which makes sense.
Yeah.
What is the difference between the Bible being the inspired Word of God and the Bible being perfect?
The Bible is full of golden nuggets. And I believe that the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are completely the inspired Word of God and are therefore to be taken at face value in its entirety. One of the reasons why I believe that is because I'm a Christian, and Christian theology, and this is, to my understanding, universal in all Christianity, Jesus Christ is the complete and perfect revelation of God, and there is none other. So, when I read the epistles, when I read the Old Testament, I am critically comparing them to what Jesus said and did. If it matches, hallelujah, praise God, I have come upon another golden nugget of inspired God stuff. If it is contradictory to what Jesus said and did, I am like, okay, someone is expressing their opinion, but this has not been inspired by God.
One of the measures you have is that God is love.
Yes. So to use an example, when you read in the Old Testament, someone says, God said, kill them all, kill their wives, kill their children, burn their houses, kill all their animals. I don't believe God said that. I believe people felt that, they believed it, and they wanted to attribute their actions to God. But that's not what God said. I just read recently a 1,700 book by a conservative evangelical preacher pointing out that in the Old Testament there are very glaring, overt contradictions between God telling the Israelites not to do anything, that he would handle the situation with the tribe or the king that they're having trouble with. And then in the next paragraph, it would say God told them, go wipe them out, kill all the women and children and burn it all down. Contradiction after contradiction after contradiction. God is either how Jesus depicted God, or he isn't. There's no contradiction there. God is love.
I think what many people have struggled with is that there are things that they haven't understood and it doesn't feel right in their heart. And so I think it makes it a bit easier when you can look at it and say, well, it's not perfect, but it was inspired. And I think when I was growing up, I kind of thought the Bible was just sort of here. It's all together. It's always been. It always is. But it was many books written by many, many authors that were pulled together and put into this book.
Over a very long period of time. But there's such amazing things in the Bible. To speak, not as an apologist for the Bible, but one who loves the Bible and reads the Bible. For example, scholars pretty much agree that the book of Job is the oldest piece of literature in the entire Bible. And if one reads the story of Job, it is as wise and rich and amazing today as when it was composed somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 years ago. I mean, seriously? Seriously? I mean, you read the book of Job, and if that doesn't make the hair stand up on your head, nothing will. It is a great book. How does that happen?
The topic of your first book, My Descent into Death, was your story of dying, of going to hell, of being rescued. The thing that I've always had a hard time believing is that God would allow eternal suffering. And so I was intrigued by something you wrote in your book. And you said, He loves those who do not go to heaven, and He has plans for them also. How He will love them is also a mystery. So tell me more about what you meant.
First of all, I am the first one to admit I don't know what God's going to do. I do know my experience, and I do know something about the Bible because I've studied it, and I've read lots of opinions of wise people about the Bible. Okay, number one, the Bible is very clear. God's hope, H-O-P-E, hope, is that all people will come to heaven. The Bible never says all people will come to heaven. Jesus and the Bible talk about people who reject God, don't go to heaven, and go to an awful place. The term that Jesus used multiple times, he says, quote, they will be cast into the outer darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, where the worm never dies. That pretty well describes where I went. I went to that place. And Jesus uses a lot of ways to warn people about rejecting God. One of the things that the Bible states very clearly is that in the end, the devil, the demons, and all evil will be utterly destroyed, annihilated, gone forever. So, there's another extreme prophetic statement from the Bible about what happens to evil. Now let's talk about something in between that is relevant to what I experienced. The Bible says in 4 different places, anyone who calls upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. That's what I experienced. I called out to Jesus, He came into that place, He rescued me, and He turned my life around and sent me back to try and live it right. Could He do that for someone else? Of course He could do that for someone else. Good old Dr. Spock, who was very influential a few decades ago about child rearing. He was very against spanking, but he promoted the idea of children being given by themselves times, like demanding that they spend time alone in their room or sitting in a chair with their face turned towards the wall or whatever. I think a lot of teachers use that form. In other words, okay, child, you need to go and think about what you did and why you are now being isolated and have lost your privileges. Is hell perhaps God's form of rehabilitation for hardcore sinners? It certainly was for me. Can people in hell call upon the name of the Lord, and of course I'm talking about calling from their heart, not just, hypocritical, pleading. And Jesus will come and rescue them. That was my experience, and I have no reason to believe that it wouldn't be somebody else's experience. So therefore, can people be rescued from hell? And my response is unequivocally yes. And I also want to say that the people that I experienced in hell were exceedingly angry and anti-God, and they were not ready, and whether they will ever be ready, I don't know. C.S. Lewis, who I admire very much, in his book, The Great Divorce, talks about the devolution of people in hell. And what happens is they lose all of their character, their personality, and just become almost like an amoeba. Maybe that's what happens to some people in hell. I don't know. I am not a universalist who believes that everybody goes to heaven no matter what they did and there is no such thing as hell. I'm not one of those. And I find it interesting to think about and speculate what could possibly happen to people in hell. But I'm not God, and I'm painfully aware of that, and I don't know what God's going to do. All I know is that God is loving and kind and wise, and God's going to do everything he can to save people who are lost. That's what the Bible tells us over and over and over again.
In your book, you write that hell is where we get to have all of the hurt and pain that we have inflicted on people come right back to us.
Yes.
Do you think it's equivalent to the pain we've caused, or do you think it's worse than the pain we caused?
Well, I only think it's worse because in hell there's no hope, there's no joy, there's no love. What people inflict on one another, either as the predator or as the victim, is done in those circumstances. One of the really good things about us who are not in hell is that when we do something stupidly wrong or intentionally out of anger or rebellion, whatever, we have the opportunity to reconsider, and as I mentioned earlier, even to own up to it, change our direction, and ask for forgiveness, which is traditionally expressed as confess, repent, forgive. And when we do that, we no longer have to suffer with what we did, and we no longer have to dwell in that wasteland of guilt and blame and shame, which is, those things are all utter waste of time and only detract from our lives. And we can get that joy back down in our heart and live fully lives going around appreciating the goodness and the beauty of the world and sharing that with others. They don't do that in hell because there is no goodness and beauty and love in their lives.
It's interesting what you were just saying about, if you're asking for forgiveness, you're forgiven. And I had another guest, Brian Hoyland, who was saying that the things that he had felt sorry for, that he, prior to going to heaven, he really wasn't judged on those, but he was judged on the things that he hadn't really paid much attention to, that were things he had done against other people.
I've thought a lot about evil and sin and what we should do and shouldn't do. And I have come to the conclusion that apathy, indifference, lack of compassion is perhaps the cruelest form of hate. Let me try and dramatically illustrate this. If you were walking through the city and there was a little child, filthy, alone, forlorn, and crying, if one were to say to oneself, "Oh, look at that poor destitute child. I certainly hope someone comes and helps that child. I would do something, but I have an important meeting to go to, or I have my really good clothes on and can't get involved with such a filthy person, or I just don't have time to deal with it." Those are excuses, but they show no compassion, no love, and frankly are showing real contempt for that little child. Apathy can be covered with all kinds of excuses, but when we are called to a situation, we have to respond. One more illustration. I was driving on a road on Cape Cod.
Whatever the day brings, she's confident.
FDS woman.
She's confident, fresh, and nice to be near.
FDS woman, so very confident.
FDS for safe feminine deodorant protection every day.
What a woman.
Whatever the day brings, she's confident.
FDS woman.
She's confident, fresh, and nice to be near.
FDS woman, so very confident.
FDS for safe feminine deodorant protection every day.
What a woman.
Whatever the day brings, she's confident.
FDS woman.
She's confident, fresh, and nice to be near.
FDS woman, so very confident.
FDS for safe feminine deodorant protection every day.
What a woman.
Whatever the day brings, she's confident.
FDS woman.
She's confident, fresh, and nice to be near.
FDS woman.
Ja, was perfeito, homem.
FDS woman.
She's confident, fresh, and nice to be near.
FDS woman, so very confident.
FDS for safe feminine deodorant protection every day.
Honestly, what on earth is going on? I feel like each and every day that news articles pop up on my phone, it gets weirder and weirder and weirder. What is the agenda behind this? What are they trying to hide? Like, what is it that's actually going on here? Or are people really just this ridiculous? Maybe they are. Maybe it's that simple that people are just that ridiculous. Honestly, what on earth is going on? I feel like each and every day that news articles pop up on my phone, it gets weirder and weirder.
Miss Pitt.
Every day her body changes. FDS woman. But she's what a woman. Every day her body changes. FDS woman. But she's confident and fresh with FDS. FDS woman, so very feminine. FDS for safe feminine deodorant protection every day. Whatever the day brings, she's confident. FDS woman. She's confident, fresh, and nice and clean. FDS woman, so very confident. FDS for safe feminine deodorant protection every day. Whatever the day brings, she's confident. FDS woman. She's confident, fresh, and nice and clean. FDS woman, so very confident. FDS for safe feminine deodorant protection every day.
Today's episode of Thinking Thursday is a bit different for a handful of reasons. One, we're focusing on two people instead of one. We're also focusing on a lot of drama, although maybe that's not so different. We've had Hypatia's murder, we've had Boethius's execution, Spinoza's excommunication, the Catholic book ban, the Salem witch trials, so we've had quite a bit of drama. But what if we introduced a forbidden